Hi, and welcome to Global Studies with Miss Pritchard. This is a video for Global 2 students. It will cover the Russian Revolution. It is going to cover many of the same events that we saw in the biography of Lenin that we watched in class. So what you need to know is that the Russian Revolution took Russia from an absolute monarch to a totalitarian regime. So basically, the more things change, the more they stay the same, because the Russian people still did not have any freedom once the revolution was all done. So let's see where it began. The beginnings. The Russian Tsars are the last absolute monarchs in Europe. Keep in mind, the rest had been overthrown by democratic revolutions or had voluntarily given up their power to democratic institutions. The government alternated between liberal reforms and conservative absolute rule. You can see that very clearly with Alexander II and Alexander III. The father was a liberal reformer, frees the serfs, but then he is assassinated and his son comes in and is an absolute monarch that reinstitutes the terror state and secret police. So you frequently had them shifting very quickly from one ruler to the next. And what you need to know is that a majority of the population lives in extreme poverty. The serfs are a step above slaves in that they weren't owned individually by people, but they were considered part of the land. And they're not freed until the 1860s, much like the slaves in the United States. All right, industrialization did not modernize Russia. The factory workers are not safe, nor are they paid well, and keep in mind they're generally uneducated, which explains why they were not safe or paid well. And farmers did not benefit from the technology because they were constantly working and barely survived, and most of the technology that is produced is to help in transportation. It is not to help in farming, unlike the early Industrial Revolution in Britain and even in the Americas. All right, 1905 is a turning point in Russia because Russia loses a war to Japan, which is a blow to their ethnic and their national pride. They are beaten by what they view as a bunch of little brown Asians, when they're supposed to be this big white European powerhouse. Then you have the soldiers firing on a peaceful crowd who was appealing to the Tsar for reform, and that is Bloody Sunday. So the Russians rebel, and in order to keep his throne, the Tsar institutes moderate democratic reforms to keep the power and the peace. Then you get World War I. Russia is drawn into the war because of their alliance with Serbia. They unite behind the Tsar and a common enemy, but unfortunately, as we have seen, the Russians are not very well equipped, nor are they well educated, so the troops are slaughtered due to their inadequate weapons and supplies. In the meantime, the Russian economy is failing and people are starving, and soldiers are literally just walking away from the front lines. They are deciding, I'm not going to go and get shot at, and they turn around and they walk home. So, Tsar Nicholas II is an incredibly weak leader, and this is because he never wanted to be king, and he's not very good at it. And the Russian people never really accept his wife, who is German, and the Russians and the Germans never get along. And Tsarina Alexandra, although Alexandra and Nicholas are a love match, they don't really want to be king and queen. And you add in there that their son has hemophilia, which is a blood disorder that does not let the blood to clot. So that means it's very dangerous, especially for a little boy who generally likes to do rough and tumble and dangerous things that can cause bleeding. He can't be allowed to bleed or even be bruised because that internal bleeding could kill him due to the lack of clotting. So they hide all of this from the Russian people. And the Tsarina becomes very close to a man named Grigory Rasputin, who is one of the sleaziest and creepiest spiritual leaders of all time. But he has a very calming effect on Alexei, who is the heir, and he seems to make the young prince better, even in times when he is dreadfully injured and bleeding internally. So the Tsarina comes to depend on Rasputin because she thinks he can save her son. So, 1917 is when the Tsar loses his throne. In March, the Russian troops refuse to fight. The Tsar is forced to abdicate. Kerensky leads the provisional government and begins to establish democracy. In April, Lenin is brought back to Russia because the Germans think that he will continue to destabilize Russia and that will pull Russia out of the war and let them win. So Lenin pushes to continue the revolution and establish a communist government, and he keeps advocating for pulling out of World War I. So in that aspect, the Germans were completely right. All right, October. The provisional government is faced with the same problems as the Tsar: poverty, starvation, and a losing war. Lenin promises bread, peace, and land, which the Russian people are taking to wholeheartedly because, well, they're poor, starving, and watching their children die in war. The Bolsheviks managed to take over the government. We saw that in the biography of Lenin, when the government lets them out of jail and gives them guns. Really poor decision on their part. So, Lenin wins control, signs a treaty with Germany, which does give Germany a lot of Russian land, but it also gets Russia out of World War I. Then you have Lenin and the Bolsheviks establishing a communist and totalitarian government. Keep in mind, communism is the economic belief that everybody should own all of the parts of production, whereas totalitarianism is describing the control that the government has over the everyday lives of the people, and it is total control. So the White Army continues to fight to restore the Tsar because at this point they don't want a communist government. In July 1918, Lenin orders the royal family executed, and that is pretty much to stop the White Army from fighting. If there is no Tsar or family to fight for, the White Army has to give up. And keep in mind, they do kill the entire family, even the family dog. Then Lenin establishes his totalitarian government. He dies in 1924, and that is when Stalin takes over after a brief power struggle with Leon Trotsky, who was another one of the more masterminds behind the Communist Party. So, total control. Stalin uses secret police, known as the KGB, to keep track of all enemies and, to be honest, most citizens. He purged real and imagined enemies by the thousands. There are estimates that over 20 million people died in the time he was the leader of the Soviet Union. All opposition and religious views are eliminated, and propaganda is used to support the government and control the people. So remember, propaganda is any information that is used to persuade you to buy or to believe what is being offered. So, the results of the Russian Revolution. We have the first communist government in the world based on complete equality and justice, although it does not work that way at all. Stalin pushes to industrialize the nation with his 5-year plans, which are also complete failures. Farms no longer produce enough food, so people starve. Another huge problem. Only heavy industry is developed. As I said before, they had this tradition of the technology not actually improving the day-to-day life for people. And keep in mind, women enjoyed equal rights. Notice that equal rights is in quotes. That's because they could study for any profession, but they didn't have any political rights or freedom, as did anyone. So, overall, the results are incredibly negative if you are a freedom-loving democracy advocate. you guys need to write these notes. Make sure you show them to me for credit.